I'd like to welcome you all to the second session of our workshop on financing the circular carbon economy. My name is Msha'al Shalan. I'm a co-founder of EON Collective, which is a nonprofit waqf that aims to communicate sustainability and advocate for sustainable practices. I'd like to begin by thanking you all for attending and really thanking our friends at EUI and the World Bank on this collaboration, as well as our friends from Shell for making it today. And hopefully we'll be able to touch a bit on their Northern Lights project and gain some insights and perhaps see opportunities for replicability in Saudi Arabia. So today we're gathered here to talk about the future. The nature of the future is that it's uncertain, but equally within it holds infinite possibilities. The COVID-19 pandemic allowed us to collectively reflect and reimagine what would our world look like. So a pathway that once seemed predetermined to take us to 4 degrees C is all of a sudden shifted with the hail of ambitious goals and targets to take us closer to a relatively safer operating space of 2 degrees C. But how can we ensure that those ambitions are met? And even more importantly for us here in Saudi, how can Saudi, as His Royal Highness the Minister of Energy always says, lead in that effort and help develop and deploy the vessels needed to reach our climate goals? How can we at once be the Germany of renewables, yet equally deliver on our ambitions to not only maintain, but increase demand for Saudi oil? At first, that might sound contradictory, but one is a little bit assured when we think of the relatively easier pathway to decarbonize Saudi oil when compared to other resources globally. How can we deliver on that ambition equally in a very credible, quantifiable, scalable, economically profitable, and socially mindful way? In the last session, we've covered carbon pricing, and we've noted that it's a very strong tool among many. But it was equally discussed that globally, it's been proven that in and of itself, it is not enough. So today we're going to start introducing and hopefully discussing with all of your great insights in our second hour, what the other possible policy pathways would look like. We do know that government has a vital role to play in regulating, deploying policy tools like procurement conditionalities. And in this instance, as I usually like to say, taking on both risk and reward for such investments. So how can the government continue to engage in an active role of co-creating value? When we're looking at Saudi Arabia, and in particular the Saudi Public Investment Fund, PIF, we see that it understands this particularly well. This is reflected in the strategic investments made over the last year. But this role is not new for Saudi Arabia. It has effectively deployed public-private partnership in the 70s when the Ministry of Energy, back then it was known as the Ministry of Petroleum, in collaboration with Aramco, was able to first study, then develop an integrative gas system when most of the gas used to be flared. Instead, it was caught and deployed as feedstock, and with it, developed the massive refining and petrochemical industry in the cities of Jubail and Yamba. So how can we replicate this for CCE? And how can we deliver it in the right way without overextending the role of government? What can we envision the role of the private sector, in this instance, to play both on the local and on the global level? So envisioning pathways for neutrality, both for the kingdom and on a global level, would require us to put human ingenuity in overdrive. Most innovation comes out by trying to solve for a problem, and there's no greater problem than that of climate change. So this is but a first step in our attempt to explore what our options are, and an initial attempt to answer the questions that are asked, drawing upon the deep well of knowledge that Professor Delbecchi and other colleagues are bringing to this conversation, and more importantly, their international experience, while taking it as an opportunity to introspect into the breadth of experiences and ingenuity that our colleagues from Saudi Arabia are joining us on this call in the second hour. So as much as we can, we're here to learn, but equally on our side at EON, we're here to listen. So I handed you over to the very capable hands of Professor Delbecchi. Professor Delbecchi, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Princess Mashal. I think your words are very important, and the scene you are setting for our debate is very relevant. Even more so in a world where we see that more countries are expressing themselves on a path to net zero emissions by 2050. And the developments in the United States, for example, are very important in that respect. So I think our discussion should be put into that context, because we discussed last time the carbon pricing as part of a comprehensive policy combination or a set of policies, but also this time we are going to zoom in more on promising technologies in manufacturing, in the energy sector, and also in the finance that is needed to sustain that. But the real question that we were very eager to engage in, as we are doing with other countries, you mentioned that we are engaging internationally. We talk to the South Africans, we talk to India, to China. We are planning talks after this one with Mexico, with Brazil, with Indonesia. And the question is always squarely on the table, in this case for Saudi Arabia, what is it that the country is planning and putting itself in a perspective of this, more announcements of the world moving into net zero by the middle of the century, which is after all, in fact, making more operational what the Paris Agreement that we all agreed to in 2015 was all about. So I'm very keen to participate in the discussion. I think we prepared a number of interventions from our side. I'm also very keen to see the participation of Mr. Kibai Broom from Shell, who is going to enlighten us about an important project, the Northern Lights projects in Norway, because I think the way the energy sector is seeing itself as part of the overall context of the net zero emissions by 2050 is going to be a more compelling question the more things are developing. And the fact that Europe is going for a Green Deal, is planning a raft of measures to be announced by June of this year, is just an indication. It's not just Europe, it is also Asia, it is Latin America, it is Africa moving into that direction. So thanks for having us today. Really thrilled by the debate. Thanks to Aon for a splendid cooperation we had so far, and very eager to learn more in the discussion later today. Over to you, Princess Mashal.
Thank you very much, Professor Delbeke. And I see that Angela has joined the call. I don't know, Angela, if you wanted to say a few words before we give the floor to Rebecca.
Thank you and good morning. And I'm really sorry I joined late. No, I think at this point, I think it's better for us to get straight into the conversation. I know most of the people on the call were on the earlier workshops when I introduced our work and at the World Bank through the CPLC, where we are collaborating with different stakeholders to try and promote a constructive and enriched dialogue around these issues with a view to be able to inspire action going forward. So I think at this point, without further ado, it's better that we continue with the conversation. Thank you.
Please take the floor, Rebecca.
Thank you, Princess Mashal, also Professor Delbeke and Angela. I will wait for the slides from Simaima. Okay, great. Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. We thought it would be interesting. As you all know, this is the second webinar on the series. We had the first one on 3rd of February. Before diving in on finance and technologies, let's quickly go through the key uptakes from webinar 1. Next one, please. Thank you. So here listed 3 key uptakes. The first one has been mentioned by Princess Mashal already. It's without doubt that the kingdom needs a mix of policies. So carbon pricing on its own, it's not enough. We aim at today going through other policies and instruments to have the global picture. Next one on low carbon technologies. We all know it's at the heart of the kingdom. Okay. For many solutions like reducing, for also reusing and capturing carbon emissions. Now the question is how to scale the technologies that have already been demonstrated and how to accommodate the needed infrastructure in the kingdom for that transition through low carbon technologies. And the next and the last pillar as a key uptake from webinar 1, revenue from offsets is a potential domestic instrument for nature-based removals and also a potential financial revenue for CCUS development. Now, whether the kingdom's domestic offset market goes forward, there must be a special effort put into the monitoring, a transparent monitoring, reporting, verification, and registration system. Next one, please. Many questions were raised during webinar 1. We're looking forward to having many more today. Some were left unanswered, unresponded, because we would be tackling some of those subjects today. Like, is it realistic to be looking at carbon neutrality at national level? What would be consumer sensitivity to rising costs? Some financial disclosure of carbon market instruments, also key remarks on the status for the CBAM, CLC, and many others. They will be tackled during the discussions and then during the debate as well. Next one, please. Okay, so some ingredients, enablers of the low carbon transition have been placed here. As we can see on top, CCUS technology will not make it on its own. We need many ingredients put together for creating this robust fundament for a low carbon transition. Starting from carbon pricing. So here are the ingredients with some 1 or 2 questions next to it. How the 2 major approaches to carbon pricing, namely carbon tax and cap and trade, compare in the context of a possible future kingdom's climate policy. On scale, can scale drive CCUS costs down to below projected carbon prices? On standards, how can the kingdom create gold standard CCUS, which would be satisfactory internationally, and how to make these activities currently aligned? On sustainable finance, that my colleague Dan will be diving in, how would these activities fare under new sustainable finance rules? Then next, commented in the first slide and here, on monitoring, reporting, and verification, how to have a solid and transparent system in place, very important ingredient as well, all together for a circular carbon economy. And so what could be a potential pathway for the kingdom? And then what would be the socioeconomic outcomes? This closes, let's say, the stock taking of webinar 1 and also introduces the key features that will be discussed today. This is from my side. Thank you.
We invite straight away Jan to introduce the sustainable finance dimension of the discussion. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Do you hear me all right? Yes.
We do when
okay,
we see your slides. Yep.
Yeah, great. Well, indeed, there's an enormous development going on sustainable finance and the rules and regulations that are applicable to and describe and define sustainable finance. And it is a very recent development, something of, say, the last 5 years, but it's taken rapidly a scale on a global level in which both central banks, key players of the financial systems, and whole industries are aligning on some of these rules. And at the moment, this is still in development. Very few of the regulations have been enacted and have become hard law, but you already see where it is going, and you already see also how financial institutions are spontaneously jumping to those conclusions and try to be ahead of their competitors in terms of capturing this market on sustainable finance. And let's say the goal there is firstly to attract finance at a low cost of capital for financing new technologies, renewable energy technologies, sustainability technologies, low carbon technologies. But it's also for big industrial players and also players in the oil and gas sector to transition towards a new, let's say, new global energy system. And there, this transition also needs funding. And so you see that it is both a mean of funding for new players, newcomers, new big renewable-based companies, but it's also the oil and gas majors are also tapping into these funds in order to finance the transition. And that's why I think it is very important here to have a look at these rules. Next slide, please. We will look at three key ingredients of that new system. One is the international taxonomies, the second is green bond principles, and the third is climate-related risk disclosure, and they interact. We will see some of these instruments on their own might not make an enormous impact, or at least.
Where does this fit the question of ammonia in the hydrogen scheme of?
Well, yeah, I think, okay.
Hello. Yes, so we will touch upon hydrogen and ammonia a bit later, so I'll come back to that. If you look at the taxonomies, green bond principles, and climate-related risk disclosure, those are the three key elements that are driving this movement. Next slide, please. When we look at the taxonomies, there are a number of them around, and I will present you the EU one, and I will also compare it to the Chinese one, just to show, and we don't want to be EU-centric in this, that the EU one is the most advanced, both in terms of detail and in terms of rules, the stringency of the rules, and in terms of the likelihood of it becoming a law, an applicable system for the whole of the EU and all the financial institutions in the EU. So that's why I present this one, and I then make the comparison with the Chinese one. Now, the EU taxonomy is has 6 environmental objectives and tries to categorize the activities, the investments into activities according to these 6 environmental objectives, and it has 3 selection criteria applied to them. The first is that in order to be considered a sustainable investment, the activity has to be seen as substantially contributing to at least one of the 6 objectives: climate change mitigation, adaptation, sustainable use of water, the circular economy, pollution, and protection of healthy ecosystems. And so to be sustainable finance, it has to contribute substantially to at least one of them, and it cannot do significant harm to any of the other. So you cannot trade between the environmental and climate impact. You cannot say, oh, well, we'll do something which is terribly, which contributes substantially and massively to climate change, but it runs down the healthy ecosystems. For instance, if you would say, oh, we'll use the biomass of the Amazon in order to have sort of biofuels, well, obviously climate change mitigation might be helped with that, but the healthy ecosystem would suffer from it. And so that would not be allowed, to make an extreme example, that would not be allowed under sustainable finance rules. And lastly, it also has to comply with a number of social standards, which are mostly related to the ILO. Now that's the EU taxonomy. In the next slide, oh, sorry, there's a point coming before it. Now, no, let's go to the next slide. So this framework has already been decided by the European Union, and now there's a consultation that has happened on the technical screening criteria, because obviously, what does it mean to substantially contribute to, say, climate change mitigation? And how do you define it? Where do you put the thresholds? And how, you know, what is in and what is out? And at the moment, there's a huge discussion going on in the European Union between Parliament, between in the working groups, in consultation, in webinars, to define those technical screening criteria. And those have not been decided yet. They have not come out. It will be what is called a delegated act, but that the Commission will take. But it's under discussion, and that's where it is at the moment. And if you look at some of the technologies that we've been talking about, if you look at carbon capture and storage, then it is clear that carbon capture and storage under the current rules would be eligible, and obviously subject to regular review, because it's also something that is dynamic. The criteria might become more stringent as time moves on, but at the moment, carbon capture and storage are squarely within the definition of sustainability, does substantially contribute and does not significant harm. So the capture of emissions are eligible, provided that it enables economic activity to operate under these respective thresholds, and also it demonstrates that there's not too much leakage in the operation. So the leakage for transport has to be under 0.5%, and the facilities for sequestration have to be shown to be permanent and obviously also not subject to leakage. That's where carbon capture and storage stands at the moment. And if we relate it then to the activities of electricity generation, cement and steel, and if you say we're gonna operate facilities, or we want to attract investment for facilities which include carbon capture in the process of electricity generation or cement making or steel making, then again, there's a number of thresholds defined. Some of them, like for electricity, are already defined. It has to be under 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. For cement and for steel, they have not been defined yet. Shows you this is still very much under development, and it shows also that these thresholds are rather strict. I mean, to get under 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, your carbon capture needs to be really a very performant system. Moreover, if we look at electricity, the threshold will be reduced every 5 years, going to net 0 gram by 2050. So there as well, it shows that it's a dynamic thing and it becomes more stringent over time. So that is where, if we look at the technical screening criteria and we're looking at using fossil fuels in these industrial applications, or fossil fuel with carbon capture and storage attached to it, it shows that we are, let's say that it's within the rules of sustainable finance, but it's a moving target. And so one of the big questions is, and this morning I joined another webinar on that, where the discussion was, yes, it's admitted, but we don't expect carbon capture and storage to make a big splash here. I mean, it's been 15 years that this technology has been tried. It's not getting much traction, and it's not getting to sort of a competitive commercial offer. So we're not sure that in the future this will be much developed under sustainable finance. And so the challenge is there. I mean, if someone thinks and believes in this technology, you can prove it. You can attract sustainable finance for it, but you have to make it work. And that's where the EU taxonomy would let's say would be applicable to that. Then, if last slide on the taxonomy, the next slide, please. Just to show, it's not only the EU who is moving into that, but it's also, for instance, you have a Chinese taxonomy, and in the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, the EU and China have agreed to compare methodologies and try to work towards common understanding of these taxonomies. So there's already a sort of a coordination movement going on. Now, I explained you the EU one, which is the most detailed, the most advanced, and so forth. If you look at the Chinese one, this is more really about pollution prevention and control and promoting green industry. And it's more a policy tool than, let's say, a rule applicable and enforceable on the specific financial institutions. The green bond project catalog is a bit more stricter because there the question is, if a financial institution wants to emit a green bond, how can it be used? In the EU, that's quite clear. It has to be used for taxonomy confirmed activities. In China, again, they also talk now about 6 environmental objectives, but there's no, for instance, do no significant harm rule in China. There's also a looser classification and the principles or the technical screening criteria have not been developed to the same objective. So this, all in all, a broader system and a broader categorization of sustainable finance and green bonds that is applicable in China. But also there, we expect it to move further in the future. And as these discussions between the EU and China go on, they will, for sure, they might sort of upgrade or at least tighten the rules on the Chinese taxonomy. Other big economies like India and so forth are also looking to taxonomies, either a home-based one or an adopted one or a mix of the two. So this is really a global phenomenon at the moment. Then in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yes, the second instrument is the green bond principles. Basically there's 4 components, already touched upon it. One is the use of proceeds. In the EU, that's clear, it has to be taxonomy aligned. In more broader principles on the let's say of the green bond principles are pollution prevention and control and circular economy processes. That's the scope of these principles. And then the 3 further principles are very important because they need to underline and support the relevance and also the credibility of the green bond emission, and they have to be able to show that in when evaluating the project and selecting the project, it has to be clear that they fall under the rules. So it's not something where you can do a report and hide it in the drawer. No, it's really in the principles. If you want to qualify as green bonds, there has to be clear communication on how this has been evaluated, how the selection has been done. Same thing for the management of proceeds. It has to be tracked. It's not something that you say, okay, upfront, it will be used for these activities that are eligible under the proceeds. No, it has to remain under these rules. And so you need to track it over time. And then fourthly, reporting is important and external verification is recommended under that. Also there in the EU, the green bond standard is something that might become law. It's not yet enacted, so it's still under discussion, but is building on the taxonomy, the European green bond standard. And at the moment, let's say the EU financial institutions, industrial companies are the biggest emitters of green bonds. So the standards might there be defined in law. If that will be happening in the future. And then in the next slide, so this ties, and the last point of the green bond principles already indicates that, it ties into the disclosure rules, which again is a very important evolution in sustainable finance, because it is a movement which is not only coming from governments, but it's actually very much within the financial industry itself, becoming spreading and becoming an important way of showing that backing up the promises of climate neutrality, backing up the promises on investments, and showing that your industry, your company, your financial institution has assessed the risk of climate-related impact, so the consequences of climate change, but also the carbon risk, mainly the exposure to carbon emissions, which in the future might become problematic and might become a burden or a liability in terms of assets. And so the climate-related disclosure under the task force has been that's been kicked off under the leadership of Bloomberg. It's a global phenomenon, and there again in the EU we are looking at making this law, making this compulsory for all big institutions. But it's not only in the EU that this is happening, and these disclosure rules, which have to do with the governance, is your organization does it have a certain governance around climate-related risks? does your company have a strategy in terms of climate and carbon risks, and does it plan financially accordingly? Is there a model and scenarios for risk management, and what are the metrics and targets that are adopted? Those disclosures in the, let's say, the standard reporting tools that are out there in the financial sector, adding those risk assessments will become very important, not only to flag your commitment to sustainability, but also to assess and show your risk that you might be having in terms of moving to net zero targets and so forth. So these recommendations of the task force for climate related disclosures are feeding into ESG screenings by major financial institutions. I mean, you see these reports now all the time. Big financial institutions having screened all their activities on ESG, so environment, social, and governance elements, trying to come up with non-financial information on that, and there's huge specialization going on there by big companies who are doing these screenings. So this is really getting traction in the financial sector. Secondly, it is feeding into legislative initiatives on disclosure and reporting. In the UK, not Australia, the New Zealand, the EU have already announced that there will be compulsory disclosure rules. In India, there's more and more tightening of these rules. China, I already talked about. The US under Biden might also move that way. So you see that in the G20, this is on the rise. And there will be legislative initiatives on disclosure, which will then provide also the basis of data to build the taxonomies on. And then thirdly, not unimportant in this the current monetary environment, there's also more and more movement by the central banks to require stress tests. The Bank of England has announced it, the ECB has announced it, the Federal Reserve has announced it, and they are building the frameworks and the methodologies at the moment. There's been tests on a number of companies, but this is going to be widened. And so macroprudentially, there again, the whole financial systems in US, EU, UK is moving or being screened by central banks on their climate impacts. So you see, this is, I mean, the takeaway message from this, and then we can go to the next slide. The takeaway from that is that this is serious. These are serious evolutions. I mean, the fact that the financial world is now moving almost faster than governments in going for not only announcing or making commitments to net zero, but also putting in place all the metrics, the disclosure rules, the screenings that are necessary to make this verifiable and credible. I mean, that's something which can change finance in a more substantial way. Can I have the next slide, please? We're getting to the end of this, because you see, green finance is on the rise. At the moment, you could say it's still a marginal phenomenon. It's about 1–2% of the bonds, the bond market that is out there, but it is rising exponentially. And that's, I think, where we have to look at it. It can become very rapidly, and with the kind of commitments that are out there by big financial players, it can become very rapidly a very big thing. And so what you see is that what we can expect is that there's going to be trillions of sustainable finance in the next decade. The EU oil majors are already completely converting under the pressure from new renewable giants. There's been record write-downs in 2020. Shell, for instance, I mean, we have our colleague from Shell here. I mean, Shell has made a big write-down in 2020. There's a big fear of stranded assets. So at the moment, the market is very afraid of continuing to invest in fossil fuel assets. Divestment is going on. And if you look at the mix of technologies that is maturing, renewable energy, electric vehicles, heat pumps, hydrogen, and you could put a question mark on each of these, how far they will go, how fast, which kind of technologies, is it only sort of passenger cars, or will it be trucks and buses as well? When it comes to EV, hydrogen, still a big question mark. So, but they are maturing, and that's important. They are going to cost levels which are undercutting fossil fuel infrastructure cost. And so that's, I think, the test once, and we see it with renewable, once you are there, it's going very fast. And so the combination of finance and technology maturing is a very potent evolution in the energy system, which is speeding up at the moment, and which is supported by the kind of sustainable finance evolutions that I've been talking about. So last slide now. Sorry, I took a bit longer. My conclusions on this, and then there's a number of questions. The CCU, CCS, so the carbon capture, utilization, storage, direct air capture technologies are eligible under sustainable finance rules. So if you want to attract sustainable finance and have a go at these technologies, you can. It is green, it is sustainable, so there's no limit at the moment on this. Transparency will be very important. It has to be verifiable, it has to be credible. And so also as part of the disclosure, it's very important that this is done right, that the metrics are in place and are correctly verified even by third party. And then thirdly, so there's a possibility for oil majors to tap into sustainable finance. It's not something only for the 100% green, 100% renewable companies. You can finance activities with that. You can sort of, in a percentage way, transition towards. It's possible. So for me, the question is, because there's a big, as I already indicated, a question mark on carbon capture in the debate in Europe. But if someone wants to show it can work and it's a competitive technology, it's possible. And so I think there's an interest for companies in Saudi Arabia to have a go at this. So I would think to prove this technology right can be an important motivator in a transition and in a circular carbon concept. And so last slide then on the questions. For me and for us, there's a number of questions there which would be interesting to have your views on. One is, would international companies or Saudi companies look into international sustainable finance to fund these projects? Would carbon capture utilization change the carbon and climate risk assessments that we will see in companies active in Saudi Arabia? And then the question on the circular carbon pathway, could it change the international finance risk as indicated in the whole disclosure movement? Could it actually change the perception of risk for Saudi companies and broader for international companies? So I think these are a number of questions that merit to be discussed. Sorry for taking a bit longer than foreseen. And I now give the floor, I think, to Christian.
Thank you, Jan. And now we go to Christian Egenhofer on key technologies. There were so many technologies, and in particular CCU, CCS, that you highlighted, Jan, that are going to be eligible for sustainable finance, and that also oil majors could tap into these possibilities of sustainable finance. Now, widening the question to more technologies is what Christian is going to do. There's not only CCS, CCU, there's not only renewables, there is a raft of technologies out there that could be used in the path towards net zero. Christian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Jos. I would like to give a quick overview on the technologies as yours indicated, but also the future value chain on how it's seen from an industrial policy perspective. Can I have the next slide, please? When you look at the low carbon transition, more or less you will find those areas which are on this slide, so I call them building blocks, which will be needed to come to a net zero economy, to a net zero situation whenever that moment will arrive. Now, the low carbon electricity is the most advanced. We know most of it. It's renewables and nuclear. And I will afterwards go in much more detail through all these technologies. Energy efficiency, we also know quite well. It's about demand and supply efficiency to reduce emissions. But at the same time, also, at least in many of the countries, it's a means to reduce the scale of the new low carbon investment, which will be massive as we need to replace the traditional fossil fuel based infrastructure with the low carbon one. Mobility, it is a lot of it is about new technology, but it is also about new concepts. It will probably not work if you're just replacing or substituting the internal combustion engine with a hydrogen fuel cells or a battery electric vehicle. There will also be new concepts emerging. On the industrial decarbonization, we will need a lot of materials to build our renewable and mobility infrastructure. We will need a lot of steel, cement, copper, you name it, and all that will need to be low carbon. That will be the major area for, starting in the second half of this century towards the next one. The industry, the infrastructure, we will require a totally new infrastructure. No need to go into too much detail at that moment. And also the bioeconomy will be at the heart of the low carbon economy. And I will explain the infrastructure bioeconomy a little bit in more detail in the next slides then. And then needless to say, if you talk about net zero, there will be a lot of demand for negative emissions or removals, as we have partly discussed in other meetings already. Now, let me go to the next slide and go into a bit of more detail, give you some of the assessments. When you look to the low carbon electricity, yes, you fall on renewables, which is wind, solar, wind, offshore wind, of course, biomass, biofuels, nuclear energy is also quite present. And then here we have the first time carbon capture and storage. I would see it more of a transition until we get to a more renewable, but carbon capture and storage will appear many other areas as we go through these technologies in industry and materials. It will play a major role in infrastructure. It will play a role, and then of course also in the removal. So, and then afterwards we have Kim from Shell who will speak about CCS in even greater details. The low carbon electricity value chains also will require a whole new set of balancing services. So hydrogen and electricity carriers need a storage. We talk about batteries, electrolyzers to produce the hydrogen. Energy efficiency, the traditional energy efficiency, supply efficiency, end use will still continue. But the real driver of energy efficiency in the next decade will be the electrification. As you all know, the electrical vehicles are several times more efficient than combustion technologies. And therefore, the electrification will really be the main driver. We calculated, and it's done several times. If you, for example, replace the internal combustion engine in Europe, we have about an ownership of 50% per capita. So every second person has a car. If you replace this by battery electric, you have just a mere 20% increase of power. So there you see the power of efficiency in the electrification. When you look to the infrastructure, you see that we need a completely new infrastructure. Grid technology is quite well understood to integrate the more and more renewable power. There is a lot of innovation and a lot of investment and R&D going on there. Charging and balancing will be one of the big challenges. And then here you see already the digital infrastructure will be a key part. And talking again, infrastructure, you need low carbon materials here, as we have discussed before. If we could look to the next slide with the more technologies, which is mobility. Could I have the next slide, please? Yeah, mobility. Mobility is fairly straightforward. We have 4 options. You pick electricity, biofuels, where we have big limits, hydrogen, and synthetic fuels. And in the end, the market will decide which of those technologies will be the most successful. The industrial decarbonization really distinguishes into feedstock, low carbon energy and material feedstock, and the new processes. The material feedstock, here we are talking a lot about recycling circular materials. There is a very few, I mean, I haven't seen any analysis where you can get to lower carbon or a low carbon industry without a circularity, without recycling, etc. Many processes exist coming to the process side. They again will require CCS, cement. You could have CCS in steel as well, or hydrogen. Again, biochemicals will play a major role there. And just on steel, I could show you 2 other slides. I won't do just on the various steel technologies that exist to go down a low carbon route. The bioeconomy I have already mentioned. We're all aware about biofuels and the sink function. Increasingly, the material substitution element of the bioeconomy will become important. Here we talk about bioplastics, biochemicals, and biotextiles. And the key element of this will be, again, the circularity. You know that everything related to fibers can be recycled, reused, and recycled many times, which will eventually make these technologies more important. And then on the negative emissions, to finish with our technology overview. Here again, we have nature-based ones, but also technology-based. CCS, CCU, here we come again, backs the bioeconomy with carbon capture and storage, and a number of geoengineering technologies. We can imagine that these technologies will get more and more important. And in my work, there's more and more people sort of starting to look at this, and there's more and more interest, and technologies are developed. Maybe could I have the next slide to move a little bit to how the countries position themselves in this, how they position themselves in this global effort, and to gain industrial benefit. I believe that the most advanced sort of comprehensive policy has been developed by Japan in their green growth strategy, which has recently been presented. They divide the technologies in the different sectors, and there they identified a number of value chains. I don't want to go through with you all of them, but I want to pick one of each of the category. When you look in energy, it's quite interesting that they're making a division between the short term, the transition to the full hydrogen economy, and the hydrogen economy itself. So they position themselves first. We want to be leading on this initial transition until we get to the full green hydrogen economy. On the transport manufacturing, at the bottom, you see carbon recycling, and that includes many different points, including concrete, biofuel, plastic materials, but of course there will also be a carbon recycling in this. And then on the home office, there's again the resource circulation plays a big role, the circularity. And maybe just to add on as well, it's quite unique for the Japanese approach that they're looking into lifestyle related technologies, which we in Europe, for example, have not been looked. If we could go to the next slide, which is about China. China was very early to capture these economic opportunities. Already in 2011, there was in the 5th-year plan, there was an identification of 3 strategic emerging economies that are climate environment related, a new energy, you see it here, energy conservation, environmental protection, clean energy vehicles. Clear, they all relate both to local pollution control, and promoting the green industries as well as climate change. So they looked at the various options that serve them best from their domestic policy areas. And now in the 13th fifth-year plan, they have again reiterated the need of nuclear and small and large nuclear as one of the 5 strategic emerging economies. So currently they are betting on nuclear. Now, if we go to the European side, if we can have the last slide before we come to the questions. The European industrial strategy along these strategic value chains has also been gaining pace with the European Green Deal. In the aftermath of the Green Deal, there was a new industrial strategy in which there was a number of technologies to be identified and be brought to the market. Again, the ones we would expect: steel, chemicals, construction, renewable hydrogen, low carbon industry, raw materials. This is the list I was mentioning before. Interesting is on the upper right-hand side, you see that a number of countries look at their economies and see where are our opportunities. So for example, Sweden and Norway, not part of the EU, look very much to fossil-free shipping. France, well known to nuclear energy, certainly with the small modular reactors now. And Portugal has been developing quite a comprehensive strategy on the blue economy, being surrounded, of course, by a lot of sea. Europe, very specific to Europe, is very much, because of its decentralized nature, the industrial alliances, which bring together national governments, industries, international governments, other stakeholders and funders, where we try to discuss and try to put a policy framework around these core value chains. There is a battery alliance, there is a clean hydrogen alliance, a low carbon industry alliance, a raw material alliance, and you will see much more. These alliances are also open to international cooperation. Ukraine has just asked to be joining the Battery Alliance of the European Union. So I see a lot of opportunities for cooperation. Now, let me also go to the questions which we have identified here. And they are really which technologies are the most promising from a Kingdom of Saudi Arabia perspective. Under which conditions could these technologies be brought to the market? So which technologies relate best to the Saudi conditions? And then maybe on the international side, we spoke a lot about the lead in the global effort. So what could be the kingdom's contribution be in leading this global effort to deployment and the reduction of costs of these technologies, which we all will need in the future in a low carbon world? I'll be finishing here and hand over to Kim, who will be speaking about carbon capture and storage, or maybe Jos, you want to take over.
Okay, just as an in-between between you, Christian, and Kim, I think it's very important to indicate that the world at large is taking this direction of low carbon technologies. It's in Asia, it is in Latin America, it's in the United States, it's in Europe. So I think that is a very important element. But we didn't want to refrain from showing a specific example of a country that is heavily relying on oil and gas, which is Norway. And for that reason, we are very pleased to have Kim By-Bruun with us from Shell to highlight what is happening in the Northern Light project. So Kim, can I hand over the microphone to you?
Thank you. Well, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all, and thank you for the opportunity to present to you today. So my name is Kim By-Bruun. From 1st of March, I will take the role as Director for Communications and Government Relations in the Northern Lights joint venture, which is a company specializing on transport and storage of CO2. I have my background in Shell, where I've been for 15 years. I've had roles in communications, government relations, environment and policy in Norway, South Africa, and Nigeria. And in my last role, I had responsibility for CCS policy and advocacy globally for the company. And I had the great opportunity to visit Saudi Arabia a few years ago, together with the delegation from the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, hosted by Saudi Aramco. And I know that a report is currently being developed on the potential of CCUS in Saudi Arabia. I understand it will be released later this year. So if you go to the next slide, please. This is a disclaimer slide, just telling you that that Shell's operations today do not reflect its net zero ambitions. But the aim is that operating plans and budgets will change and reflect the movement towards this new net zero ambition. And these plans will be in step with society's move to a net zero economy. So I'll talk about that shortly. Next slide, please. So right now, society is moving quite fast, as you understand and would have seen. So in just the last couple of years, we've seen important and big initiatives being launched by governments and corporations, and large parts of society has set their sight at reaching the 1.5 degree target. Europe has a net zero target by 2050. That means a 1.5 degree world, which achieves the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, but it will not be absolute zero by 2050, because there may still be unavoidable emissions as the world changes. It's net zero because remaining emissions will be captured and cancelled out by, for example, carbon capture and storage and other measures such as nature-based solutions, which is recognized in the Paris Climate Agreement too. So net zero emissions means no further unmitigated greenhouse gas emissions added to the atmosphere. Even in the most optimistic case, where we move as fast as possible towards total renewables, wind, solar, etc., there is still about 3 gigatons globally worth of carbon capture and storage that is required for those hard to abate, unavoidable type emissions. And that is, if we want to get to 1.5 degrees, the slower we move, then the larger amount of hard to abate emissions are left. There is a range in the different scenarios that goes from 3 gigatons per annum up to 12 gigatons per annum. So if you put that in the context of where we are today, well, today there is about 20 CCS projects working globally around the world. They are capturing approximately 40 million tons per year. Shell is active in 2 of those projects, the Quest project in Canada, where we're capturing from our hydrogen manufacturing unit and storing it underground in a nearby subsurface reservoir. And then we're partners in the Gorgon project in Australia, which is one of the largest, if not the largest, CCS project working at industrial scale in the world to date. And that's ramping up to 4 million tons per annum. So the European Union has committed to achieve net zero by 2050, as I mentioned. And earlier this year, we developed a regional scenario for Europe showing there will be about 600 million tons per annum of unavoidable emissions that will still need to be stored from that region. That translates to something like 2 CCS plants the size of the Quest facility in Canada, 1 million tons per annum of CCS capacity opening up every month from 2025 onwards. And for that reason, we are actively working on CCS projects all around the North Sea. That includes Northern Lights, which I'll talk about shortly, the Potos project in the Netherlands, the Net Zero Teesside project in the UK, as well as looking at a project called Acorn in Scotland. So we recognize the need for CCS to support industrial decarbonization. And from a CCS point of view, we are focusing on industrial hubs and the potential catalysts that may kick off a CCS opportunity. Part of it is license to operate, and you see that here on the slide. So it's looking at capturing from our existing asset emissions, and that is reducing the product carbon intensity. That is what the Porthos CCS project is all about in the Netherlands, and it includes CCS from our Rotterdam refinery. The next one is low carbon gas power, and I already mentioned Net Zero Teesside, where we are a partner in the UK looking at capturing from gas-fired power stations, which may actually longer term end up being hydrogen power stations, providing dispatchable power when wind and solar are not able to deliver the power required. The next one is a hot topic at the moment, and that is low carbon hydrogen. The long-term goal is that we get to green hydrogen, but there is a big intermediate step where we actually need blue hydrogen to enable us to move through to that long-term ambition. And I mentioned Quest in Canada already, which is capturing CO2 from the hydro manufacturing units in the Scotford upgrader there. And that effectively means it is a blue hydrogen project. So this is something we have experience in delivering already. The other element is biofuels. And it's about how we produce biofuels and make it a potential negative emission fuel option that allows us to sink CO2, not just make it neutral, but make it actually negative, which allows us to blend it to produce aviation fuels, for example. The next bit is sectorial decarbonization, and this is about how we work with our industrial partners to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sectors that I mentioned earlier. It is cement, ammonia, fertilizer, etc. And then finally, there is direct air capture. Now, this is the most diffuse form of capture, but it's still a very valid one. And if we want to get to negative emissions, it's something we need to look at, and we're doing that right now. So what we are focusing on is how to combine all of these to make up valuable projects that have the potential to make CCUS industrial scale hubs. The key thing is that we recognize that creating value chains is a foundation in our CCS strategy. We think that CCS hubs can serve multiple customers. If you go to the next slide, please. This is the Northern Lights project. And you see the different components of it here. In fact, it's more than the Northern Lights project, it's the Longship project. So the Longship project is kind of the full value chain, and it's kind of owned by the Norwegian government. Then we have three different components. We have the capture facilities, we have the ship transport, and we have the storage component. And I'll get into that shortly. Northern Lights is the ship transport and the storage component of it. And this project is challenging a lot of concepts of CCS to date. So traditionally, it has been capture, pipeline, and sink. Northern Lights is opening that up, breaking the link between capture and the store by use of CO2 shipping. And that is an important step. Northern Lights is pushing the boundaries for international collaboration in that we have seen adoption of a resolution to allow cross-border transport of CO2 for purposes of CCS. Also important to us is that Northern Lights can act as a reciprocal storage alternative to other CCS projects in Europe, making a European CCS network more robust and flexible. Next slide, please. So in a climate neutral Europe, as I mentioned earlier, around 600 million tons of CO2 per year of unavoidable emissions will need to be stored. And that's according to Shell scenarios. Northern Lights enables us to build strategic partnerships and to support CCS industry, which will be important in that context. If everyone, the project team, the Northern Lights project team, has had conversations with where to store their CO2 through Northern Lights, that would amount to 45 million tons per annum, which shows the interest is high. What we see here is where some of these conversations are happening and where the CO2 would be transported from. What you can see is the network potentially of sites and the network that may build up of other storage opportunities. The initial storage capacity for the Northern Lights project will be 1.5 million tons of CO2 per annum. The question is, should we expand? When should we expand, and how large should we expand? Just like any other project, an expansion will require further capital investment and will depend on the level of third-party interest and how quickly we can mature that interest into firm commitments. And a lot of that ties back to support mechanisms like the EU Innovation Fund and EU regulations on CO2 emissions, which are coming. There are several challenges in this space. So for us, what tariff can we charge? Capacity. If we commit to storing 1 million tons for our customers for 20 years, that is 20 million tons of our overall storage capacity already booked. So can we then sign another contract? Or do we need to develop additional storage capacity before we can sign the next 20 million tons, etc.? And then there is liabilities in the transport, in the storage element, and in particular when we start working cross-border, if we are storing, for example, German CO2 instead of Norwegian. So there are decision criteria that need to be looked at and a lot of uncertainty and risks to manage for us going forward. Very interesting and exciting indeed, and we're very much looking forward to getting started. We have started construction already, and we expect to be operational from mid-2024. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you very much. This is a very fascinating project that is opening a lot of avenues